Good afternoon and welcome to FPIES in the Classroom, where we examine the impact that FPIES has on students in elementary and middle grades during their time in school. My name is Amanda LeFew. I will be your presenter for today. A little bit about my background. I live in Western Massachusetts with my husband and two daughters who both happen to be diagnosed with FPIES. I am a board-certified music therapist, and I am also a co-director and co-founder of the FPIES Foundation. Because of my experience raising two daughters living with FPIES, I am better able to contribute to programming and resource development as co-director of the FPIES Foundation. If you would like to connect with me in regards to this presentation or for any other reason, you can email me at a.lefew@thefpiesfoundation.org. So let's go over some of the points we're going to learn about today. First, we're going to just have a brief overview of the diagnosis. What is FPIES? I know that there are some of you in the audience who are already far too familiar with what FPIES is, but we are also directing this presentation at education professionals who have only been recently exposed to FPIES. So we're hoping to spread a little bit of education about the condition. Secondly, we're going to take a look at why FPIES needs a plan. Why is there a plan needed to get through the school day? And we're going to take a look at IHCPs, 504s, and IEPs. The bulk of this presentation is really going to be examining the impact of FPIES, and that's in consideration with the activities of the school day and the accommodations that often need to accompany that school day. We're also going to discuss how essential connecting and communicating is between both families and the school. And we're also going to look at why it's important to view FPIES as a chronic condition and how that can really help us to develop appropriate plans for our students who are affected. Finally, we're going to talk about becoming an advocate, because any of you who are connected with students or loved ones who are affected by FPIES, all of you are advocates, and there's different ways to explore that advocacy role, and so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And finally, where to find resources. I hope that your learning about FPIES continues past this presentation, and we want to provide you with some resources to really get started on your educational journey as you learn more about FPIES and how to help those who are affected by this condition. So what is FPIES? FPIES stands for Food Protein-Induced Enterocolitis Syndrome. It's an uncommon and often poorly understood type of food allergy. So this type of food allergy affects the gastrointestinal tract. Classic symptoms of FPIES include profound vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration. It's important to know that these symptoms can lead to severe lethargy, changes in body temperature and in blood pressure, and unlike typical food allergies, these symptoms are not immediate following the ingestion of a problem food, and unfortunately they do not show up on standard allergy tests. There are no tests for FPIES. The only way for an individual to know whether or not a food causes an FPIES reaction is to actually undergo a food trial and ingest that food and see what happens. And finally, reactions can be triggered by any food, and affected individuals can react to any number of foods. For instance, some may react to 1 or 2, where others may react to 5 or more. Again, as we go through this presentation, a lot of our focus is going to be on remembering to consider the individual and their experiences with FPIES. And just as the amount of trigger foods can be individualized, so can many other aspects of living with this condition. So when you're thinking about FPIES, there's two different ways it can really present. You can see FPIES present in acute reactions and chronic reactions. Acute, or sometimes referred to as classic reactions, have that delayed onset after ingestion of the trigger food that is marked by profound vomiting and diarrhea. Now, these reactions can lead to hypovolemic shock, and they require emergency medical attention. According to the research, 15 to 20% of acute reactions do progress to shock. So it is important that if your students are experiencing an acute FPIES reaction, you seek help immediately from the emergency department. It is also significant to note that an EpiPen will not stop an FPIES reaction. They need to get to the emergency room in order to receive treatment. Secondly, chronic reactions are another way that FPIES can present. So in this case, a chronic reaction occurs when a child is ingesting a problem food as a consistent part of his or her diet. Symptoms may include increasingly severe vomiting, diarrhea, and poor growth, possibly progressing to an illness mimicking a severe total body infection. So both of these are serious in their own way, and it's important to know the difference between the two. So before we move forward, there's just some key facts to remember about FPIES that I really want to emphasize. The first fact is that FPIES doesn't only affect babies and toddlers. Though onset of FPIES reactions typically occur in the first year of life, older children can continue to experience reactions. And though many children do outgrow their FPIES triggers by the preschool years, some children continue to experience FPIES reactions into later childhood and into adolescence. And finally, in the medical literature, there are still some reports of adults experiencing FPIES reactions. So again, when or if an individual outgrows their FPIES reaction, it's very individualized. So how is FPIES different from other allergies? Well, FPIES reactions are caused by an immune system response to a food trigger, but unlike IgE food allergies, IgE antibodies do not cause FPIES reactions. The mechanism is still unknown at this time, and it is our hope that as research continues that they will discover what specifically that mechanism is. So IgE reactions typically occur immediately or shortly following food ingestion, whereas FPIES reactions are delayed 2 or more hours following ingestion of the trigger food. And that can make tracking down the cause of the reaction a little bit tricky. So remembering that delayed onset reaction is key in trying to track down what the implicated food might be. And finally, if you are becoming familiar with FPIES or a family who is affected by FPIES, you might hear the words food trials and food challenges, and you might be wondering what they are or what the difference between the two is. So a food trial is when a new food is gradually introduced over a period of days for the first time. The child experiencing the trial is monitored for signs of tolerance, and these are usually documented in a food journal. A food challenge is when a food that previously caused an FPIES reaction is trialed again to see if that food can now be tolerated. When it comes to food trials and food challenges, a child may experience anxiety about upcoming trials or challenges. And this really relates to the experiences that they've had in the past, or maybe what they've heard about what can occur during a trial or a challenge. So if you have a student that may have some trials or challenges coming up, or maybe during the school year there's going to be several trials or challenges that are ongoing, it's important to be aware of that anxiety that may be present, and tap into any resources that might be able to help that student process those feelings. And finally, trials and challenges that end in reactions can cause the child to feel unwell for several days following the immediate reaction. Even if the child is taken to the emergency room and receives appropriate and prompt treatment, it doesn't mean their body is going to bounce back right away. Just as if you had a severe stomach flu, you wouldn't feel 100% like yourself the next day. It would take you several days before you started to feel like yourself again. So when we talk about different accommodations and things in regards to the everyday school schedule, this is important to remember that sometimes those accommodations might need to change a little bit, and this is a really good example of a time when the child might require some extra accommodations if they're recently recovering from a reaction. So let's step into the classroom. The first thing we need to do is we need to get a plan. And there's lots of different plans out there. There's 504s, there's IEPs, there's IHCPs. Now, it's important to know that regardless of primary plan choice, every affected student needs a medical plan. If your student has a diagnosis of FPIES, they need a medical plan in place. So the 504 plan is a plan that lays out accommodations for the student to be able to access his or her education. Depending on your state or on your district, this may require a medical proof of diagnosis. Typically this does, but I know there are differences between districts, so it's important to be aware of what is required in your own state or district. An IEP plan is an individualized education program, and this is a special academic plan that lists goals and objectives to target specific academic educational areas. An IHCP or IHP is an individualized healthcare plan, and this targets the medical needs of the student, identifying who will address these needs and how he or she will do it. So as I mentioned, no matter what plan your child or your student has in place at the school, they need to have a medical plan. So what goes into the medical plan? What are some of the components? You need to look at information about any special medical equipment and or prescriptions that are used during the school day. So some students with an FPIES diagnosis may receive elemental formula to supplement their diet, and some students may receive this orally, whereas others may require a feeding tube for that. And so a feeding tube would be a type of special medical equipment that might be required by a student based on their needs. An example of a prescription used during the school day, elemental formulas, prescribed by the doctor. So that may need to live in the nurse's office, for instance, because of its need for refrigeration. Information defining the student's diagnosis, FPIES and any others. As we all know, of course, diagnoses can coexist. So FPIES may be the only diagnosis, or there may be others, and it's important that the medical plan includes all of those. with the FPIES diagnosis, we also want to include a list of safe foods as well as known triggers with descriptions of past reactions. Now, please remember that past reactions do not always predict the severity of future reactions. So if one of your students has a history of mild to moderate reaction to oatmeal, for instance, if they were exposed again, they may also have a mild to moderate reaction to oatmeal, or it could be a severe reaction. FPIES can be unpredictable, and it's important to remember that those past reactions don't necessarily define what future reactions could look like. The other little caveat that I'd like to add there too is the emphasis on a list of known triggers. With older children, they may have tried most, if not all, common foods already. However, not all children have tried all common foods. And until something has been trialed, there really is no clear way to know whether or not that food is safe or not. So when you're looking to see what foods are safe to be around your student, you really want to rely on what their list of safe foods is. And with some students, those safe foods may be brand specific. So that is a really important discussion to have between the teachers and the family. So the next component of the medical plan is a description of how to prevent, identify, and respond to an FPIES reaction. And you're going to hear these three words a lot today. So prevent, identify, and respond. So what is entailed there is what to do during a reaction, who to contact during a reaction, where to go for treatment during a reaction. This could simply be the nearest emergency room, or a student may have a specific hospital he or she receives treatment at. And finally, how to help the student re-enter school after recovering from a reaction. And that goes back to what we were discussing earlier about the potential for additional accommodations may need to be in place as the student transitions back to school. And finally, developing a portable medical plan for field trips and other off-campus events. When your student affected by FPIES goes on field trips, or maybe there's a soccer competition on the weekend, anything school related that they're traveling away from the actual campus, you want to have that portable medical plan in place so that way, if something did happen, you would have all the information you would need to get that student prompt and appropriate medical attention. The role of the school nurse is so important. We have been so fortunate in my family to have had wonderful, supportive school nurses that have been amazing allies for my daughters. So this role, don't underestimate it. It's very important. So what does the nurse do? The nurse helps to advocate for the student affected by FPIES. They help to manage the medical equipment, medical food, or prescriptions safely. And a big part of that role is to educating other adults who interact with the student about FPIES and the necessary accommodations, and educating other students about FPIES and how to keep the classroom safe. Next, the nurse also provides support to affected children and their families. And the most important part of this role is that the nurse is the go-to person during an FPIES reaction. The nurse gives directions to others and ensures that the student's needs are met. So let's get into the bulk of this presentation when we talk about activities of the school day and adaptations that we want to take a look at to help the day run smoothly. So first we're going to look at what's entailed in a typical school day. Next, we're going to talk about before school and after school programs, bus rides and transportation, extracurriculars and clubs, field trips, daytime and overnight, parties and celebrations, and finally, a little bit about preparing for school-wide emergencies, such as lockdowns. So let's take a look at accommodations for a typical day in the classroom. Navigating a typical school day can go smoothly with the proper accommodations. Every child is different, but there are some basic accommodations that we can consider. So to start, we want to maintain a food-free environment. This includes playgrounds, parties, and celebrations. We want to look at frequent hand washing for all students. Hand sanitizer does not get rid of food proteins on skin or surfaces. So we really want to make sure we have hand washing or vigorous wiping down of surfaces or the hands with clean wipes. So you might ask, why maintain a food-free environment? Well, even in older students, even in high schoolers or even in adults, there have been studies that show people put their hands to their mouths frequently. If you have food residue on a surface, oftentimes you cannot see it. And if that surface is touched by someone's hand and their hands then go to their mouth, you could have a potential exposure. It depends on the sensitivity of the individual, but keeping a food-free environment can really help to make the student feel less anxious, but it also can eliminate some risks. So it's a really important factor. We want to also have frequent wiping down of surfaces and to be sure to use a new disposable cloth or wipe or a clean cloth. So when you're wiping down those cafeteria tables, you don't want to wipe down one table, dip the rag back in the bucket, and then go wipe down the next table. We want to, keep the cloth clean. Another area you might want to consider is special seating at lunch, in the classroom, or on the bus. It depends on the age and stage of the student and the unique needs based on that environment. Another area of consideration is frequent bathroom breaks being permitted. Some schools may call this a permanent bathroom pass. Depending on the students' experiences with FPIES, they may or may not have that need to frequent the bathroom often. So it's important to have that discussion with the family and with the student in a considerate, private way, and to really look at what his or her needs are during the school day. Unlimited excused absences or tardy slips when related to the medical condition. Depending on the school year and depending on the student, he or she may be experiencing a lot of food trials. He or she may have some scheduled medical procedures to rule out other conditions that may mimic the symptoms of FPIES. And many students who are affected by FPIES do go see specialists, and often those specialists can be quite a distance away and can require the entire day be spent traveling to and from medical appointments. Because of these factors and others that are related to this condition, students may miss a lot of school. And again, it depends on each individual, but this is another discussion to have, between the teachers and the families about what may be anticipated in the year ahead and how you're going to navigate this. You know, that unlimited excused absences doesn't necessarily mean that, you know, they're not going to turn in their work or anything like that. It just means the planning may be a little bit different. You know, if a student anticipates that they have a medical procedure coming up and they will be missing some school for that, perhaps some planning with advanced work can be assigned. So the next area kind of piggybacks on that, allowing additional time to complete work. So that can be in regards to absences. They may need some extra time to complete the work because of absences, or they may need extra time to complete their work if frequent bathroom breaks are needed. It's really hard to complete a task if you have to keep getting up and down to go take a bathroom break. So allowing that extra time can really reduce the anxiety for the student, and also it can help them to, you know, put their best effort into their work and end up with a better product in the end. Allowing student access to a second set of books or class materials to keep at home for unexpected absences. Again, this goes back to, you know, if a student is experiencing food trials, you know, unintentional trigger exposures can happen. So having that second set of books or class materials at home can help the students stay on top of their work in the event of these unexpected absences. The next area is really important, obviously, because FPIES, you know, and it's a diagnosis that involves a student's reaction to food. So there need to be accommodations for school lunches. Safe foods must be provided. We cannot deny access to free or reduced school lunch if a student qualifies, and that lunch that they're receiving must be safe for them. So before the school year starts, it's important for the families and for the school staff involved in planning the lunches and in ordering the food to sit down and talk about what are the needs of that student and how can we address them so that that student can receive a nutritionally appropriate and safe lunch when they are in school. We also want to educate all adults that encounter the student in how to prevent, identify, and respond to an FPIES reaction. And when we're educating other adults, we want to inform them about the student's trigger foods, again with the caveat that that list of trigger foods may not be exhaustive. There may be other triggers out there that we don't know about yet because we simply haven't trialed them yet. We also want to educate students about FPIES and food allergies. And this can get a little sticky sometimes, especially depending on the age and stage. But we really want to enlist the students in helping to keep each other safe. And when you're planning for that and really thinking about ways to present that information, it is helpful to include the affected student in planning this process so that we can make sure that they're not unintentionally put on the spot or embarrassed by anything that might be discussed. And in addition, you know, students are so creative and they may have some really great ideas about how to discuss FPIES with other kids that maybe we as adults wouldn't think about. So definitely make sure you include them in the process. And finally, but so importantly, create special plans for field trips, extracurriculars, transportation, and so on. It may seem like a lot of paperwork and a lot of planning, but having those things in place really can help not only reduce the anxiety on, you know, the part of the student, the family, and the teachers, and all the other professionals involved, but it also helps the day to be smoother and safer. And then everybody has better access to their education. And with that, I would like to add a note on access and accommodations. So according to federal law, food allergy can qualify as a disability, which permits students affected by FPIES the ability to be covered under a 504 plan. As we mentioned, 504 plans implement accommodations that allow a student to fully access his or her education. This is so important. Access cannot require that student to pay in order to attain access. So what does that mean? It means that school lunch needs to provide a safe and nutritionally appropriate meal option for that student if it is needed. You can't expect a child to be able to bring their lunch every day. That may not be an option for every family. And that, again, is part of accessing their education. They are entitled to an appropriate school lunch. Next, a family cannot be required to pay for supplies that are needed to ensure a student's safety in activities of the school day. So, for instance, wipes for wiping down surfaces, safe supplies for a required science experiment. If these supplies would be provided for any other student, they also need to be provided for the student affected by FPIES in order for them to participate safely in activities of the school day and fully access their education. A student's participation in activities during regularly scheduled school hours, so field trips, science experiments, so on, cannot be denied due to the student's parent being unable to attend and supervise for safety. You may find that the parents of your student want to be there for every field trip, every, special circumstance, whatever it may be. You may find that you have parents that really want to be there, but they can't because of their jobs. Or perhaps they need to be there for another student. We've had experiences like that where I wanted to be able to chaperone my older daughter's field trip, but I couldn't because I had to take my younger daughter on a specialist appointment. These conflicts happen, and a student's participation in these activities cannot be denied because the student's parent is unable to attend. So I just really want to drive that point home and remind us all that it's important to plan ahead so that we can figure out a way for that student to be able to participate safely with or without their parents' participation. So before and after school programs are used by lots of kids, and they're a great way to support kids who, don't have somebody at home to be there when they're out of school or just need the extra support. So you may have a child affected by FPIES in your before-after school program. So here are some things just to keep in mind. We want to keep it food-free. If a snack time is necessary, which it might be, I know sometimes these programs can run long or run into meal times and kids get hungry. So in that event, let's consider having a specific area for eating that is separate from the activity space. And in addition, we want to be sure to wipe down all surfaces prior to use. So important to educate all the staff. And because there isn't usually a nurse involved in these programs, though there might be, you want to determine a point person who's going to take charge if a reaction occurs. And they're kind of going to take on that role that we talked about the school nurse having during a reaction, if there were to be a reaction. We want to train staff on how to prevent, identify, and respond to FPIES reactions. And again, there should be an emergency plan that is readily available and that has emergency contacts listed. There should also be a device for emergency communication. That could be a cell phone, it could be a walkie-talkie, whatever it is, it needs to be in place in the event that something did happen. And again, educate other students about FPIES. And this goes back to what we said before. Be sure to include the affected student in this process so as to make the education not only clear, but also not to be too personal or embarrassing for that student. Depending on the program, you might want to consider a buddy system, and encourage the students to look after each other and to know how to report to an adult if an emergency did occur. And of course, as goes with anything, you want to consider additional modifications based on age and stage as well as type of programming. There are so many great programs out there, and I'm sure the staff could be really creative in thinking of ways to help a child affected by FPIES be able to access their programs. So 3 other areas that we want to look at that require adaptations are bus rides or transportation, extracurriculars, and field trips. So with all of these areas, there's a lot of similarities. The number one thing is, if at all possible, keep it food free. And we'll get into some of the modifications for that on field trips, because I know that can be a little difficult depending on the type of field trip. Next, we want to educate the responsible adults involved. So on bus rides, it's the drivers, extracurriculars and field trips, staff and chaperones. Everybody needs to know how to prevent, identify, and respond to an FPIES reaction, and everybody needs to know how to access the emergency plan and what the emergency plan is. Again, we need a device for emergency communication, and we also, in accordance with their emergency plan, we also need to know where the nearest emergency room would be. And that can be different depending on where you are. If you're in an extracurricular in the school building, it's going to be the same place that the student would probably go if they had a reaction during the school day. But if you're on a field trip across the state, you're not going to be going to the same emergency room if you needed to receive emergency medical attention. So that's important to know. Now, some specifics in terms of bus rides. You might want to consider assigned seats. Wipe down the bus seat prior to the affected child sitting down. And again, you might want to consider additional modifications based on age and stage, and that really goes for anything we're discussing here today. Age and stage are so important in knowing what supports the student might need to have in place. So some additional areas with extracurriculars. Again, educate students involved about FPIES. And again, you might want to consider a buddy system like we were talking about their after-school programs, so students can get used to checking in with each other and helping each other to stay safe. Now, we're going to go into a little bit more detail with field trips. A lot of the same things that we consider with bus rides and extracurriculars hold true to field trips, but there's also some additional areas we really want to think about. So number one, remember when we talked about the portable medical plan? This is the time we need to really bring that portable medical plan along, because field trips could be right down the road, or field trips could be a couple states away. And having that medical plan follow the student is going to help everybody if emergency medical attention is needed. So you want to develop a plan specific to each field trip, just as soon as the trip is scheduled, not the week of, not 2 days before, but as soon as you go to put that field trip on your calendar. One of the first questions to ask is, where is the nearest emergency room? Who will accompany the child in case of a reaction? How will all chaperones be educated in how to prevent, identify, and respond to FPIES reactions? Even if you have your students already broken up in groups and each chaperone is assigned to a specific amount of kids, things happen during field trips where one chaperone may need to take over another group, even for just a short period of time, and unfortunately, emergencies can happen when we least expect them. So it's important that all chaperones be educated about FPIES reactions and what to do in the event of an emergency. And this is not a very fun question to ask, but it is important. Is this field trip too risky? Is the theme of the field trip something food related, and is that food a known trigger for your affected student? That might be too risky a field trip. So that's something to really weigh in on and really objectively look at to make sure that everybody is able to stay safe. And again, consider special accommodations based on age and stage or ability of the students. And some final questions to consider. What if the student's caregiver cannot attend the field trip? What's the plan? Will the field trip involve a mealtime and/or overnight stay? Because you're going to need a little bit of modification to your plan if those aspects are involved. And finally, will the field trip involve a cooking activity or other activities including food? It's important to know that in advance. We had an experience where my older daughter was going on a really cool field trip to a historical site, and where the kids were going to get to do all sorts of activities that kids their age would have done way back in the 1700s. Well, I found out the day before that they were supposed to be making applesauce from scratch, and apples are a pretty major trigger for my daughter. And we discussed that would probably not be the most appropriate thing for her to participate in, and were there some alternatives? We ended up deciding on making pear sauce, because pears are a safe food for her. But I had to run out the night before the field trip and buy several pounds worth of pears, and then also enough for me to make pear sauce at home, because I didn't know if the tools they were going to use on the field trip were going to be contaminated or not. So I didn't know if the pear sauce the kids were making would be actually safe for my daughter to eat. So it was this crazy last-minute ordeal that really could have been avoided if planning had been done a little bit in advance. So activities like parties and celebrations can be such a fun part of the school year. But for families who are affected by FPIES and food allergies, sometimes when we hear about a party or celebration come up, we get a little bit nervous or filled with dread. So here are some things to keep in mind. When it comes to these, just keep it food-free. If you make a party or celebration activity-based, generally the food is not missed, because the focus is on a different aspect. We want to educate all responsible adults. That includes class parents, teachers, student teachers, about FPIES and about food allergies. And before we even set foot in the door for our party or celebration, we want to send a letter home that informs all families about the food-free policy and why it exists. And when we do that, we want to refrain from identifying any students who are affected. So affected by FPIES, affected by IgE food allergies, whatever the reason is that they would benefit from a food-free celebration. We also want to have a clear course of action for individuals who try to bring in food for the celebration. It sounds wild, but it happens. I had one year where my daughter's teacher was so great about, she sent home letters to the families, she sent reminders out before every party, and inevitably we would end up having to field random food that was brought in some kid's backpack. So having a clear course of action for what happens to that food if it shows up is really important, so that the families sending it in understand that it's just really not acceptable, and it will be handled in a very specific way, and it will not be included in the celebration. You want to establish a point person that monitors for exposures and/or reactions. Parties are a lot of fun, but it is unstructured time, and so it can be a little bit more difficult to monitor students. So having somebody that's really keeping an eye on things can help. When it comes to school-wide or community events such as fundraisers, these can take a bit more advanced planning and education, but they are still very possible to execute food-free. When it comes down to it, emphasizing that safety for all students must be priority number one really just needs to be the bottom line. Now, in regards to celebrations and events, we actually have this really great resource at the FPIES Foundation that is a worksheet about FPIES awareness in schools, and it gives a huge list of all different ideas for food-free ideas for activities and celebrations. So I encourage you to go to our website and take a look at that. We mention it in the resource section at the end of this presentation, but I just wanted to mention that to you now. So if you're having a little bit of a mental block and having trouble thinking about, like, what kind of food-free events would work at our school, check out that list, and it might give you some really great ideas, or maybe move you to think of some ideas of your own. So finally, let's talk about emergencies. So school-wide emergencies require planning. We do lockdown drills, we do fire drills. There's already all this planning in place, but additional special planning may be needed for your students affected by FPIES. Some of these emergencies to consider are in terms of lockdowns, in terms of what to do during a natural disaster, and emergencies related to your locality. My daughters went to a school that was by the woods, and sometimes there would be animals on campus, and they had certain protocols for, what happens if they see a coyote or some other kind of animal. So there may be emergencies that are related to your locality. So you may be wondering, why do these have anything to do with FPIES? Well, I never thought of it before either until our school nurse said something to me right after my older daughter started kindergarten, that she would need to have kind of like an emergency shelf-stable supply of, say, food for her. And the reason for that is if they were experiencing a lockdown, if, there was maybe flooding in the community and the kids had to stay overnight at the school for whatever reason, they would need to feed them. And though they would have food on hand in the cafeteria for the majority of the student body, for my daughter, she would not be able to safely eat those things. So they needed to have just some very basic items on hand in the event that they needed to have an extra meal at the school, and they needed to be able to provide something for my daughters. So having that extra school or extra food supply there can also be helpful. And again, this was brought up by our marvelous school nurse. She said, sometimes kids spill their lunch in the cafeteria on accident, or they might accidentally spill their drink on their lunch. And rather than having to go without eating anything, because nothing in the cafeteria is safe for them to buy, they could go to the nurse's office and just get some shelf-stable snacky things that we might have on hand for them so they didn't go hungry. So when things go wrong, even when all adults supporting the affected student are really actively trying to maintain the safest environment, things can go wrong and reactions can happen. So that's why we have a plan in place, and it can really help to see us through those times. So what do we do in the event of a reaction? Number one, we follow the emergency plan. And as you have already done so, it's probably set in place from the beginning of the school year, and that's what you refer to as the emergency plan. Contact emergency services, then contact the caregivers, then the student's care provider if requested. Have the staff ready to accompany the student to the emergency department. A staff member must document the time, place, and circumstances of the reaction. That information is very important to the family and to the child's medical provider. When you go to the emergency department, bring the emergency plan, bring the medical information, and information about FPIES to the emergency department. You may be asking, why would I bring information about a medical condition to the hospital? Well, surprisingly, not all medical professionals know what FPIES is, and sometimes even if they maybe have heard of it before, they don't have a good understanding of it. So when you go to that emergency department, it's important to have that information in hand so that if the medical professional needs to learn more or wants to learn more about the condition so that they can know how to best help the student, they have that information at their fingertips. Now, a little earlier I mentioned that when you're contacting everybody after the reaction occurs, the parents sometimes might ask that you contact the student's care provider, and the reason for that is sometimes when the child is seen in the emergency department and the medical professional seeing the child isn't familiar with FPIES, sometimes they're more receptive to learning about FPIES from another medical provider. So if you give the student's care provider kind of a heads up that they're on their way to the emergency room and they may need you to speak to the attending doctor in the emergency department, that can be helpful to having the student's care be expedited in an appropriate way. Unfortunately, sometimes when practitioners aren't familiar with FPIES and occasionally can be resistant to hearing about it from others, care can be delayed, and it's really important during an FPIES reaction that care is prompt and that care is appropriate. It is an emergency situation. And in regards to that, I also want to add, it's so important to never, ever, ever, ever leave a child unattended during a reaction. That child could be 7 or 17, but FPIES reactions can happen very quickly and make a person very sick very fast. And, they can result in loss of consciousness. And, a child could be vomiting profusely and unable to hold up their heads. That child cannot be left by themselves. They need to have someone with them. So, what do you do in the event of a potential exposure? Again, follow the emergency plan. This is something that needs to be in the emergency plan and needs to be accounted for at the beginning of the school year. A staff member, again, must document the time, place, and circumstances of the potential exposure. Whatever you know about how the exposure happened, write it down, because again, that's really important for the family's knowledge and also for the medical practitioner's knowledge. You want to contact the student's caregivers. And so now you've got all this information you documented, and you can offer them an idea of what happened, and that can help them make the best possible decision moving forward. So depending on the type of potential exposure, In the caregiver's directions or predetermined plan, the student may need to simply be observed at school or at home. And then if a reaction were to begin, you would follow the emergency plan for a reaction. In some cases, the student may need to visit the hospital for observation. And again, this goes back to the student's individual experiences with FPIES. One reason a student might need to visit the hospital for observation is, perhaps they have a history of reacting very severely to a certain food trigger, and that's the food that student was exposed to. Or perhaps that student's reactions are always very severe, and maybe that's why the family or the medical provider who regularly sees that student prefers that they are observed in the hospital. There may also be, other medical conditions that student has that an FPIES reaction could set into motion and negatively impact. So again, this is something you need to work out with the student's family before the school year starts, so you have an idea of what to do in these situations. Unfortunately, bullying is not uncommon when it comes to students affected by food allergies, and FPIES is no exception. Bullying is a serious issue, especially for those affected by food allergies. In fact, studies have found that 1 in 3 children with food allergies report being bullied about their allergies. So what can we do? We want to let the bully and the bullied students know that you take this very seriously. Follow your school's bullying policy and get the parents involved. We're going to frame this as an opportunity for education, not only for the students, but also for the parents. And sometimes the student bullying students' misconceptions can come from the misconceptions of the parents. Not always, but sometimes. When a student threatens to expose another student to his or her allergen, they are actually weaponizing the allergen, even if the student claims he or she is just joking around. We want to make expectations clear at the beginning of each school year that there is zero tolerance for bullying, that there will be immediate and consistent consequences. And when we're having those discussions about bullying, we want to specify that in terms of bullying students with food allergies, we're going to clarify that threatening another student with his or her allergen is like using a weapon. Again, threatening another student with his or her allergen is like using a weapon. So just some general connecting and communicating ideas for interface between the educational professionals and the families and vice versa. So let's start the conversation. Introductions are best made before the start of the school year. It gives everybody a little bit more time to get the information they need and to feel comfortable. Ask questions and access information to become familiar with the student's FPIES experience. As we mentioned earlier, this is very individualized, so it's important to kind of know where they're coming from with what they've experienced. Exchange contact information and discuss communication strategies. Will you have a weekly check-in? Is the family and the teacher are they more comfortable texting or emailing, or perhaps having a written communication log? Figure out what works best for everybody. You want to establish the emergency plan before school starts, as well as the IHCP and or the 504, or in some circumstances, the IEP. The reason you want to have this in place before school starts is we want to make sure that we are getting in the habit of doing those accommodations, and it can take time to get used to using them in the classroom, and starting as soon as possible is best for everyone. So if the student is an older elementary student, middle or high school student, he or she may want to determine his or her own way of connecting with you, the teacher. And that's important too, that they feel confident connecting with you about what's going on with them and how it might affect their school day. And as you move through the year, we want to keep the lines open. Decide on a form of communication that works best for the caregivers and the teacher. And if that changes during the year, that's okay. Just let each other know, if something's not working and you need to go in a different direction, that's a good discussion to have. We want to make a schedule for regular check-ins. We do have a tool, the Parent-Teacher Communication Log. You are welcome to use that or use it as a jumping off point to create your own tools or resources. Honor the family's privacy regarding medical information. This is so important, for the family's sake, but most definitely for the student's sake. We want to be open to overtures from the student to share concerns or recent FPIES-related experiences. And finally, please be sensitive to the impact of food-related discussions in the classroom. It can get awkward if, for instance, you're having the students do a writing prompt assignment and everybody is supposed to write about their favorite restaurant and why it's their favorite restaurant. Well, some students affected by food allergies or FPIES may have never been to a restaurant. It might not be safe for them. So being sensitive to the impact of these food-related discussions is really important. So we want to talk about viewing FPIES as a chronic condition. And I believe this is really helpful when we're trying to figure out ways to accommodate the student during the different school day activities. When we think about this as a chronic condition, it helps us to realize that these accommodations are things that really need to take place in the day-to-day classroom. So FPIES requires daily life changes in order to have proper symptom management. You can't take a day off, no matter how much you want to. Things happen if you do. The list of trigger foods can be fluid, and this is due to the ongoing food trials and challenges. So, on one hand, it is possible that a student might outgrow one of their trigger foods during the school year with you, which would be awesome news, right? And you would celebrate with that with your student. But it is also possible that they may react to a new food during the school year, and so that list of trigger foods may get longer. Even milder reactions can take time for the child to bounce back. So when we're looking at our accommodations again, you might need to increase some of your accommodations from time to time based on that child's experience with reactions. A child might have psychological implications from living with FPIES. Instances of trauma related to reactions or medical procedures can occur. We've had experiences where my children have undergone severe reactions that have been very scary, and there have been times when they've been very sick from a reaction and really received inadequate care in the emergency room, and that in and of itself can be traumatizing too. Having someone you're counting on helping you, medical practitioner, not helping you when you need it. So there's some different dimensions that are involved in that, and it's important to be kind of tuned in to the different implications that come from living with FPIES and your students' unique experiences. Specialist visits are often required throughout the year, And that can vary from student to student. Some students may need to be seen every 3 months, every 6 months. Some students are simply needing to check in once a year with their specialists. So that's another part of the discussion when you're doing your plan for the year and talking about, any absences they may already be aware of. It's a good idea to know what their schedule is with appointments for their specialists. And finally, children may experience medical procedures to rule out other conditions. FPIES is what's referred to as a clinical diagnosis. So what that means is there's no definitive test to say whether or not you have FPIES. The doctor makes a diagnosis based on your history of symptoms and ruling out other similar conditions. So there may be times when a student needs to undergo a medical procedure in order to rule out another condition that has similar symptoms to FPIES. And when that happens, they may need to miss some school, there may be some additional anxiety. There's just a lot of factors involved, and it's important that the educators tune in to that and see what they can do to help facilitate that time for the student. So the FPIES community needs educators like you becoming the advocate. How do you do that? Forming connections and connecting with other educators to raise awareness is so important, because you never know when another educator might have a student affected by FPIES in their classroom, and your experience and your insight can really help them in planning and preparing for making those days a little bit more smooth, or helping to set those accommodations in place to help that student. And you can also form connections with families and students. Innovating and engaging. So educational professionals are some of the most innovative and creative people I know. You guys are always coming up with great ways to teach kids about anything and everything. So innovating creative strategies for safe and inclusive classrooms. When you come up with those different ways, you want to share them. You want to share them with your connections and other professionals at your school and beyond. And also engaging and empowering students to support each other. I think sometimes kids can really blow us away with how much they really want to reach out and support each other and to really make a community among themselves. And I think it's really important that we engage them and empower them to do that and give them the tools to help them better support and empower each other. And finally, so important in becoming an advocate is providing support for coping, supporting affected children and gaining skills for coping, self-care, and self-advocacy. And those are lifetime skills, whether a child doesn't outgrow their FPIES symptoms or whether a child outgrows them next year. Those coping skills are going to help them through a variety of situations in their life. So providing support for coping is just really an essential tool in the toolbox for every student. And to really sum it up, we want to plan for success. And when we do that, we're going to look at this school year. We're going to look at what we do before the school year, during the school year, and at the end of the school year to kind of encapsulate what we want to do to help our students affected by FPIES to really thrive and do well. So before the school year, it's important to meet with affected students and families to determine their needs. And people to meet with, this includes nurses, teachers, anybody that's really going to be involved in the day-to-day life for that student at school. And that's when we create a plan. We create the IHP and 504 or IEP. And we want to assemble supplies. So if you're bringing in the emergency food like we talked about, that might be used in the event of a lockdown, or if a student spilled their lunch at school, that's when you bring it in. Or if there's any special equipment that the school needs to order, to help the student, that's the time to do it. We also want to educate staff before the school year starts. So that goes back to those 3 words that we mentioned a lot, is prevent, identify, and respond. We want to educate staff to be able to prevent, identify, and respond to FPIES reactions, and to know what FPIES is. And finally, collect all necessary medical documents. So things related to prescriptions, medical equipment, just any necessary medical documents that are needed to facilitate that planning process. During the school year, we want to continue to reassess the plan for any changes. Are there any changes in needs during the year? Do we notice that a student is showing more signs of anxiety due to a reaction he or she had recently? Do we notice that there may be some trauma going on? So look at what changes that might be happening during the school year, if there are any. Ensure that all staff involved are following the plan. It's so important that everyone is consistent and understands why they need to be consistent. And with that, continue education as needed. Maybe there's a student teacher coming in halfway through the school year that is unfamiliar with the student affected by FPIES, and this is a great opportunity for education. And finally, maintain regular contact with caregivers. It's so important. When we have regular contact, then we can stay on top of any issues that may arise, and everybody can kind of help each other out. The end of the school year, we want to assess how well the plan worked. Assess if other professionals need to be added to the plan, like when we were talking about, if we see an increase in anxiety, perhaps should the student start seeing the guidance counselor, every couple of weeks to kind of help them work through that anxiety they're feeling. And we want to develop a new plan for the upcoming school year, so that way we have a whole summer for everyone to get educated, everybody to get supplies, figure out what's going on. And over the summer and over breaks, we want to maintain communications with caregivers for any new developments. As we said, the trigger food list is fluid. There are different aspects to this diagnosis that can change over time, some for the better and some not as much. So it's important to stay in touch and for families to inform the school staff about, what's going on that might affect the upcoming school year. And if possible, select the student's new teacher or teachers so that education about FPIES and the student's unique needs can begin early. And that way, the teachers don't feel like they're swamped with everything right at the beginning of the school year when they're already getting so much other information. And then the families can feel like they have time to establish that relationship as well. So again, planning, so important. So what is the best resource for learning more about FPIES? Just speak to the affected student and his or her family. It is amazing the amount of information they can offer to help you better understand this condition and your student's unique needs. So finally, our resource page. We have some resources to support your advocacy and action. This is not an exhaustive list, but I do hope it gets you started. And there are several documents that can be found on the FPIES Foundation website. These can come in handy for you as you're planning your emergency plans and just really preparing for having a student affected by FPIES in your classroom. So first we have the emergency action plan, then the action plan. We have FPIES information packets available in English, Spanish, and French. Like I mentioned before, we have the parent-teacher communication log, the coping strategies plan, the 504 planning worksheet, FPIES in the Classroom worksheet and Raising FPIES Awareness in Schools worksheet. And as I mentioned earlier, in the last two, there are some really great ideas for food-free celebrations and what might be fun things to do. So some websites to look at, of course. You can visit the FPIESfoundation.org. We have a lot of information on our website, but some great places to start are the About FPIES and Q&A pages. We have an online learning library, a Kids Corner, resources for school page, emergency care page, and medical literature page if you're looking for some medical journal articles about FPIES. You can also visit fpiesday.com. And I put another website on here. I put bookcreator.com. It's a really great resource to create books to educate students about FPIES, bullying, and other related issues. And you can actually get the kids involved in writing their own books as well. So with so many of us, using online education resources this year with the pandemic, this is a really great resource to try out and see if it can help to spread some awareness. And finally, some articles and books to look at for educational professionals. This is the article I referenced earlier in regards to bullying and that statistic of 1 in 3 students affected by food allergies has reported being bullied. And for families and caregivers, and obviously, teachers, feel free to look at, but I think you already have a pretty good background in this. It's about planning 504, and then a little bit of information about what an IEP is. And finally, for kids and students, we have the book Wilfred Cannot Eat Dandelions, an excellent book for elementary school students, and we actually have a video on our YouTube channel of the author, Claudine Krangle, reading the book out loud. And for older children, the ultimate guidebook for teens with food allergies. Though this is written for individuals with IgE food allergies, a lot of the considerations with IgE food allergies and with FPIES are very similar. So there's a lot to be gained from reading that book. So again, I want to thank you all for joining me today, and I look forward to hearing any questions that you may have, and I hope you learned a lot today. So please feel free to visit our website, and you can print out these slides there and access all sorts of information. Have a great day, and please check out all of our other webinars for Global FPIES Day. Thanks so much.